Welcome to Microsoft Mechanics. With the developer preview of SharePoint Framework available, we're going to take a deeper look at how you can deliver new experiences for SharePoint using common web development tools. We'll take a look at the new SharePoint Framework, new client-side web parts that provide the ability to extend SharePoint in ways that were previously unavailable in the cloud, and we'll show you the new ways you can build and test with the SharePoint Workbench, and finally deploy SharePoint web parts in your production environment. I'm joined today by Dan Kogan from the SharePoint Framework team. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me back.
So last time you were on in May, we actually introduced the SharePoint Framework, which is a new modern approach to build web parts using the preferred tools and tool chain for SharePoint. If you didn't catch that, you can catch that at the link below. But what have we been doing recently? What can you do now?
So we've recently shipped the preview for the framework. So now it allows developers to go and build web parts and actually deploy them into a production environment. So client-side web parts using the modern tool chain. Really the same way that we've been building things internally here in Redmond. So the team's been using the framework for groups and team sites and new publishing pages and team sites. And what the framework allows you to do now is take advantage of the tools and the processes that we use in Redmond to go and build your own web parts and then deploy them to a SharePoint environment.
So a common experience for us as the SharePoint team, building out SharePoint also for developers, but what can I do now with the preview that's been released?
So the preview now allows you to actually go build a web part, test it both locally on your developer machine using the local workbench. Something new that we have is the ability to have the workbench in the cloud running in your SharePoint tenancy, and then actually deploy that web part to a CDN and into a production environment.
So what are some of the parts of the modern toolchain?
So now what we're able to do is use Yeoman to actually create the project scaffolding or the shell of the project. We have Visual Studio Code, Gulp, Node.js. So really the core development tools that web developers are using today.
And we saw that back in May, but I know that we had a fairly simple thing that we built out then, kind of an image resizing web part. Can we actually walk through a page that you're going to build here and see what we can do in terms of adding web parts to that?
Right, so let's take a look at a page that I've been working on. This is just for my team here, and this is about an upcoming conference that obviously everyone's aware of. And so I'm going to build my authored page here, but I wish I could put some content in it from a list that I have. And I have a list here in the same SharePoint tenancy that has all of the sessions at the conference by title, the day of the session, the topic, and so on. I want to go and add a web part that shows that content, but not just shows a list view. I want to actually represent it graphically. So I want to have a pie chart or a bar chart that represents that data. So let's go in here and edit the page. And I would want it probably here right near the top so people can see it. Now I'm going to go and open up my toolbox and look for a web part. And unfortunately, there is no web part that allows me to do what I want.
And this is the new gallery experience. We saw this when Adam Harmitz was on the show in terms of how you can actually build out pretty robust sites here with just these web parts.
Right. So this is the author experience. And what we're going to do now is, because we have a very specific business requirement, which is a graphical chart web part that doesn't ship out of the box, we're going to go and build one.
Okay, let's do it.
Great. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is go and open up a Node.js window.
Okay.
And I mentioned that we use Yeoman. So we're going to run yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. And what this does is, as I said earlier, it's going to go and create sort of the project scaffolding for me. It's going to ask me a few questions. In this case, it wants to know what the name of the project is, and we're going to call it list chart web part. So we named the solution. It asks me where I want to do this work, and we're just going to do it in the current folder. It wants to know the name of the web part that we're going to build, and the web part is going to be the chart part.
One note for you watching at home, you've got to have the right case sensitivity of these things that you type in, right?
Yeah, that's actually true, and so I'm going to be very careful with my case sensitivity, but here we go again. This is a web part that shows data from a list in a chart. And there we go. Now this will take a few moments and it's going to run through generating the scaffolding of the project with all the folders and files that it needs. Well, there you go. So it took a few moments, but it's completed. So now we have the shell of the project that we're going to go work on, and we can start working on the web part.
Right, so now that we're loaded, can we have a look at that in SharePoint Workbench?
Yeah, so what we'll need to do is load up Gulp and run it. But before we do that, if you remember when we started Yeoman, we made a decision not to load any of the frameworks because we were going to rely on an external library.
Right.
So let's go actually install that library now so that the web part knows how to render. So
okay.
Let me just go and install that. And we've had a lot of people ask us around how do you install external libraries. Mm-hmm. So if you want to know more on how to do that, just follow this link, and we have a document out there that teaches you how to do that.
This is great because you can find things on GitHub or other content areas to be able to load them straight into SharePoint, right?
Right. And so now what we've done is we've loaded the library. We need to do one more step, which is make sure that we have the TypeScript definition installed.
Okay.
So that's the last step.
Make sure you do double hyphens as you type save, by the way.
Yes, double hyphens or things don't work well. Perfect. So now we're ready to go. So you wanted to actually see sort of the empty shell of the web part run.
Yeah.
So let's go and do gulp serve. Now gulp is going to start up, and once it starts up, it's going to launch the local version of the workbench. And there you go. So here you see we have the local workbench, and I'm going to open up the toolbox, and you'll see that we have the web part that we're working on, and we put that on the page, and there's not much to it. And even when I go into the property panel, it's pretty simple. This is just sort of a bare bones skeleton empty shell of a web part.
So you got the empty vessel, nothing really inside of the project. What do we have to do now to get it populated?
Right, so this is where we would go and add our business logic to the web part. Make the web part behave the way we want it to behave. What we're going to do is open up Visual Studio Code, open the folder where we have the project running, and there's a source code and there's a web part, and here is the web part that we were looking at. So you can see it's not much to it. It basically just knows how to render. So rather than spending several minutes watching me type a new web part, what I'm going to do is take a web part that I've already coded, and I'm just going to swap the files out. So no need to code yourself when you don't have to. So now, if you look, this actually refreshed in the background, so we didn't have to do anything, and we have a much, much more complex web part. So the first thing that we're going to do is we want this web part to be able to take some input from us. And we're going to say what lists are available in SharePoint that I could select data from. Okay. So let me just find that part of the demo. And here we are. So we have some very simple code that will simply provide a drop-down list on the web part. And this will be interesting. So let me just line up my windows here for a second. I'm going to show you what's going to happen. I want you to be able to see what's going on in the gulp window, as well as what's happening here on the workbench window. So what we're going to do is I've made the changes, and I'm just going to save this file. You notice that gulp reacted, and this was a little bit hidden, but there you go, it refreshed. So now what we have is the latest version of the web part that I just updated that will have a picker in the property panel. Okay. And I didn't have to do anything. Gulp recognized that the file changed, and as a result, my browser, because it's local, refreshed. I'm going to go in here, I'm going to edit, and you'll see that we now have a few more things in the property panel. Okay. And I can select the list that I want to share data from. So I'm going to go and I'm going to pick a list. And I have mock list 1 and mock list 2.
So these are just mock lists, but what if I wanted to wire that into some maybe SharePoint list data or something else to where I could actually start to play with it?
So there's a problem. Right now I'm just sitting local with a bunch of mock data, but really in order to be able to make this work, I need to connect to SharePoint, right? Okay. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and let's find the next part here. And the next part is actually something that we're going to remove. So if you saw, we had a bunch of dummy sort of mock lists, and I'm just going to cut that out of our demo because we don't want the mock lists anymore. What we want is actual SharePoint connectivity. So now we're going to use the framework that allows us to go and interact with SharePoint and get real session context. So we are live in SharePoint interacting with the SharePoint lists and content. So what we're going to do in this case is, rather than running the workbench locally, we're actually going to run the workbench in SharePoint. So I mentioned earlier, this is one of the new things that the preview has, the ability to go and install the workbench on your local tenant, on your own tenant rather than locally on your machine. What that means is you're going to be able to run local code with real live data up in the service. And if you want to learn how to install that, just follow the link here. Okay. We have a document that teaches you how to do that.
Okay.
Just to save a bit more time so we don't go back and forth too many more times, we have connection to SharePoint, and we want to invoke the rendering from the Chartist public library that we used.
Right.
So rather than going back and forth several times, let me just go and find that part of the demo. And here you go. And you can see that we're just really calling a bunch of functions that are in the library that let us render bar charts and pie charts and so on. So we're going to do another save. You'll see in the background here that Gulp has recognized that a bunch of files have changed. Mm-hmm. And now when I go to the local workbench, really nothing's changed because this is local. Local doesn't have access to the server and so on. But what I'm going to do now is open up a new window that has, you'll notice the URL is different. Here's the workbench running locally, and here's the workbench running on the server.
So this is an instance of SharePoint Workbench actually running within SharePoint, not locally, in your tenant.
Right, so what we have here is another version of the workbench that we've installed in our tenant, but it's executing the code that's running locally on my machine.
Right.
So the developer is working on their local machine, building their web part, but in order to have real context and real data, we want to be able to run the workbench in the service so that we can sort of bring both worlds together.
So let's see it hooked together now with
so
the
now we're going to
SharePoint.
go, you see my web part.
Okay.
It's the same web part we had before.
Yep.
But this time, rather than showing mock data, I can see all the libraries and lists that are available for me in my tenancy. I'm going to pick the one that has session info. I'm going to pick the kind of data that I want to represent, and let's just do it by start date. And I could do maybe, I don't know, a bar graph or maybe a pie chart. And this is all coming from the Chartist library that we installed. Mm-hmm. And I could decide whether it's going to be large or super wide and line.
So again, the web part's running locally on your local machine, data's in SharePoint, but how do I make this real? How do I get the actual web part into SharePoint and package that up and send it into SharePoint?
Right, so we have a couple more steps. We're going to need to get Gulp to bundle everything up. We're going to have to deploy the JavaScript code out to the CDN. We're going to have to install the web part as an app in the app catalog in SharePoint. So let's go.
Sounds easy, a couple of steps.
Yeah, it's about 4 or 5 steps, so let's go get that done. So the first thing that we need to do here, we're going to stop Gulp. We're going to ask Gulp to get everything ready to ship, to say yes when I say Control-C to stop. Okay, so let's do that again. So Gulp, :ship. And this produces the sort of end result of the code that we want. It's not a package yet. We now need to ask Gulp to package solution :ship. And so now it produces the solution. And then the next thing we need to do, as I mentioned earlier, we sort of have two halves to this solution. Part of it sits in a CDN, and part of it sits in SharePoint. Okay. The part that sits in the CDN, Gulp can actually deploy for us. So all the JavaScript code is going to get deployed. We've already configured our CDN, and if you want to know how to configure your CDN, there is a document at the link below that teaches you how to configure a CDN.
Right.
So for now, we're just going to say gulp deploy Azure storage. I got to spell storage correctly. And there we go. So the JavaScript is out on the CDN, and we have a couple more steps. We need to go grab the package that we want to install in SharePoint. So it's really just an app that goes into the app catalog. Easiest way to find that is going to be, we go back to our Visual Studio Code environment, we go to the SharePoint folder, and gulp put that file right here for us. What I'm going to do is just go to the location in the file system, because that's going to be the easiest way for me to get it out to SharePoint. Now,
the way to think about this, though, was the payload actually went up to the CDN that's actually going to run the web part. The other part, the manifest that you're generating here, is going to wire it into your SharePoint tenant.
Right. So there's going to be a few things that are in SharePoint. We need the SharePoint UI, so the experience that the user is going to get. We also need a manifest file that tells us where to go and find the JavaScript to execute.
Okay.
And so what we're going to do now is go to the app catalog. Assuming I'm an admin in this environment, I'm simply going to grab that document and drop it right into the app catalog. It's going to warn me. It's going to ask me, do you really want to deploy this? I'm going to say yes. So now that web part that we've created is available in this tenancy for all site collections to use. We've deployed as an app a single web part. And we have one final step to do.
We have to make it available in the gallery that we saw earlier, right?
Exactly. So what we want to do is we want to say, for this particular site collection where I was authoring my page, I want to make sure that the web part is available.
Okay.
And so what we're going to do there is, like any other app, we're just going to say add app. And you'll notice that the app is now available here.
Okay.
So now it's registered on my site. So I'm going to be able to go to the page that we were authoring earlier and refresh the page, and hopefully we'll see it in my library.
Show up in that gallery then when you hit the
Right.
plus sign.
So let me just refresh just to make sure that everything is up to date. And I'm going to go here. And oh, look, there it is.
Chart part.
The chart part.
All right.
And there it is. Now it's starting to render, and we're going to be able to edit that. And if you recall, we wanted the solutions list, the sessions list, and right away it's responsive, so it starts to show data. It's real time. I'm going to go in there and say I want it by date, and I decided that I liked the line and that I wanted it super wide. So there it is. So there's my part, and I'm going to now publish my page. And you'll see that as I scroll down in my authored published page, we now have a chart.
There it is, and it's all running off of live list data, so as I update the list behind it, it will actually update that visual.
Right. Not only are we going to get updates for the content in SharePoint, but because we're running the code from a CDN, if the developer ever needs to go and make a modification to the source code, they're going to update the file in the CDN, and the next time we render this page, we're going to get the latest and greatest content and business logic.
So we've seen now the modern tool chain, we've seen Yeoman, Gulp Serve, Visual Studio Code, building out really awesome web parts with tools that web developers should be pretty used to today. But where's all this going next?
So, well, first of all, we have to get out to GA. Right now we're in preview. So that's the next step. We're going to provide a lot of documentation and sample code. And then after that, people should sort of stay tuned for probably other ways to extend and customize your portals and your pages.
So many huge updates for developers and for the consumers of developer content once that's all built out. But where would you recommend, if I am a developer, where would I go to get started?
So I think the best place for people to get started is if you want access to the web part that you just saw me build. You can get that as well as general information on the framework from the links below.
So thank you, Dan, for a very great and thorough overview of how it actually built out a web part. Of course, that's about all the time we have for today's show. Keep watching Microsoft Mechanics for the latest in tech updates from Microsoft, and goodbye for now.